Sasana Wasana Tharu Niwan Dakiya Tharu Sasana
Hare kol kalaya hasha ote boita ratul saya hashe boita ratul saya Nao Chariya de baluraya de chal chalaya choluk Rehnuma
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aparna, and I thank you all for joining us today for the second episode of Saturday Sojourns. Last time, we looked at the beginnings, certain inspirations, and various influences on the profession in the subcontinent and the way forward while we were in conversation with the presenters from Pakistan and Nepal. Today, we will be focusing on praxis, dialogue, and trajectory in the Indian context to take these conversations forward with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. The Indian subcontinent, a land of shared histories, has shaped our sensibilities and tastes pertaining to design and use of outdoor space, and along with it, imparted a unique identity. The medieval times saw many garden traditions evolve across the country, captured in miniature paintings and a few well preserved sites. Colonization at a subcontinent level has influenced and subsumed the many ways of looking at land and garden and introduced a typological and stylized approach. During the colonial period, our very own notions of garden in the subcontinent were supplanted with the picturesque that had its roots in the English countryside. By the mid 19th century, the idea of picturesque became more and more prevalent in the Indian context as botanical gardens were now being handled by Q-trained superintendents who nurtured them into references for open space planning, design, and management. The following century saw a huge emphasis on horticulture-based outdoor design with introduction of many exotics. Decolonization of the subcontinent was followed by major geopolitical restructuring and was a crucial time for the young nations to demonstrate economic growth and capability. Many international names were brought in to instill the idea of nationalism through architecture. By the 1970s, Indian architects had emerged from the shadow of their foreign masters who had dominated the architectural scene till then. Architecture was now being discussed extensively in the country. There were strong and deliberate attempts to chart a way forward, which looked at both tradition and modernity. The discourse had moved forth from the idea of nation towards a new identity. It was during this time contributions by the first generation of landscape architects led to the foundation of the profession, its pedagogy, sensibilities, ethics, and possibilities of praxis. In the subsequent years, these pioneers constantly guided academia and praxis to make up for the time lost. There were recurrent themes in their works: an ecological basis for design, working with plants and planting design, looking at various anchors for spatial design such as art, aesthetics, memory, and so on, and ideas of nature and garden as public spaces within the city. Nikhil Saini's story needs a mention in this journey. A road inspector for the Public Works Department at Chandigarh and a self-taught artist, distraught by partition, found solace in secretly building a garden in memory of his homeland. He collected industrial waste such as broken crockery, terracotta, bangle waste, etc. from dump yards and created a complex magical world for himself which kept him engrossed for 18 years till it was discovered in 1975. Later on, his work was appreciated greatly and was involved in making a few gardens in the country. The following decade witnessed the next generation of landscape architects who took the discipline to many cities across the country. They showed immense responsibility by constantly expanding the role of the landscape architect. There wasn't a discourse yet. Perhaps there weren't enough projects on ground to critique at that time. A few cities like Delhi, Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Mumbai, and Pune played the gathering ground in subsequent years, which made the profession find acceptance across the country well into small residential projects. The 90s saw architecture change the grain of our cities with large footprints and glass facades of corporate, commercial, and public buildings. It was a rushed phase that saw pride in architecture merely standing out no matter how divorced the insert was from its context. It believed in global language while disregarding local traditions and context. The relation between a street and building changed radically due to the scale of built, and there was no real connection to terrain with the introduction of podium gardens, which were a result of growing parking requirement. Many foreign firms found their way into the country during this time. This introduced new software, drawing standards, execution techniques, and planting with high maintenance. These were decisive times. Mounting challenges were to be confronted with a global aesthetic, while we were still under the hangover of a few selectively preserved historic references and some hybrid styles to lean on to. As a profession, we had missed the opportunity to contribute to the larger debate on tradition, modernity, and identity, and were now to grapple with a global style which brought in with it new standards and pressures of quick delivery. Nursery stocks seemed to influence our design thinking, and lawns and palms permeated our spaces. Spirit, nostalgia, rootedness was almost lacking in a race towards universal style. The ability to interpret and engage with our landscapes, manage resources, and narrate a story that resonates with its people was fading out. To see it another way, there were absolutely well executed and good looking projects, but missed the opportunity to re establish the connect with land and seemed disjointed with architecture that wanted to make a statement and stressed on performance. Many a times, the landscape design was not talking to the building or extending the idea of architecture, also because the building didn't. It was merely playing a subservient role to architecture. This decade also brought insistence of new standards of sustainability and green ratings only to add to the chaos. The country also saw a rapid change in size of landscape practices which had the temperament and capability to meet these challenges. There was also an increase in number of practices around this time, a direct relation between opportunity and growth. A few professionals were confident about the future, while some were definitely worried. A state of lament, if we may call it, the intellectual elite of the profession, barring a few who mentored the next generations, lamented in silence over the lack of direction the profession was taking. While the first generation set the scene, the intellectual pace was set only during the last 20 years, that is during the 2000, where there was a deliberate attempt to introspect. While there were a good number of practitioners, lack of dialogue made it difficult to forge a better future or merely correct course. 2001 onwards, Journal of Landscape Architecture by Geeta Wahidua began a concerted effort speaking about the profession. In 2002, it made an attempt to discuss the larger role of a landscape architect, which involved the first generation. In 2005, there was an exclusive issue of Home Review edited by Aniket Bhagwat, which looked at the profession's current state and trajectory thus far and defined many lenses by which one may explore it. It also tried to touch upon the largely ignored aspect of landscape theory in the country. Parallelly, around this time, the Indian Society of Landscape Architects was formed under the aegis of Professor Prabhakar Bhagwat. Since its inception, it has largely helped in bringing all professionals together to have a dialogue. Today, the Society plays an advisory role in betterment of education, code of conduct, mentorship, and many more critical aspects of practice. There has been a visible momentum over the last 2 decades across the country to thrust the profession into new territories, whether it be research, dialogue, academics, or showcasing work. Which brings us to a question: who appoints a landscape architect and when? There are projects where who appoints us and at what stage is directly proportional to the role we play in steering the course of the project. In large land holdings, where the proportion of built is limited, it is essential that the landscape architect be appointed prior or at least along with the architect to encourage a collaborative effort in conceptualizing the master plan with interdisciplinary thinking rather than be called only for problem solving when it's too late. Which reminds me of a question Professor Shahir asked 20 years ago, which still seems relevant. Are architects and planners, the real estate industry, ready to accept and acknowledge our capabilities and foreground our role? Does this profession need to create its own patronage to make its role more effective? Especially in times when our cities are drowning, hills eroding at rapid pace, rivers flooding, and development encroaching further into natural edges. Thank you.
We have been running our practice for close to 12 years now. And we do see that in the past 5 years, there has been a change. And in the last 2 years, somehow, there is change. And by talking, people are understanding, and the clients are also understanding that perhaps a landscape architect has to come on board prior, or definitely there is a change. And we are doing a lot of work in setting the scene or setting the stage for the architect to, take on from there. So we do tell them now that you can build here, you cannot build here, and what is vulnerable, what is not. When we look back, even now, there's nothing much that, firstly, there's no documented work for, if I were to go back to 90s and look at what happened from 1990 to 2000. Second thing is there's no written information, there's no articles, not much talking about what was happening in landscape profession. Uh, Third thing is people, professionals, though there were quite a good number in the 90s, they were not talking to each other. So that's what I feel. It was a phase where there's nothing that we can go back and look at. And another thing was we were rushed. I do feel that because of the MNCs, the corporate sort of development that was fast paced, which was happening in the country, I think we were just playing, we were catching up. We were trying to catch up all the time, and perhaps we didn't make it. I don't know. So
And Chaya said, well, that's not the job of the schools at all. The job of the school is not to provide for the marketplace. The job of the school is to be able to instill the ideas and the dreams and the ethics of the profession, the meaning of the profession historically. And in that 2-year program, that's really the bulk of the stuff that you're being talked about, large ecological systems. I think what she's really saying is that the profession, in fact, is so far removed at this point of time from being able to create opportunities of this kind. So do you think that it leaves students unprepared, or do you think that it actually infuses in the students an idea that is much greater than the immediate, or much greater than what is really, sort of rudimentary? What is your thinking about that?
Well, I think all of us have realized that the larger realities are becoming urgently important. Actually, the school is the critic of the profession, just as the profession should be the critic of the school. And they should not get mixed up. All these young people who are passionately committed to that larger agenda, climate change, ecological degradation, all of those are their problems. They're going to live through the next 50 years. And they will fight for it. And I think that fight is absolutely required. There is no way in which we can go back to designing small gardens and saying, this is what it is, this is what I do.
I think the architectural education is extremely important to begin with. Those 5 years spent in the architecture school actually lays the foundation. And when we are coming for a master's, in landscape, then it is like an exposure to certain aspects of architecture and beyond that were not thought about, or that did not become instrumental in the way we thought.
Right.
So in one sense, it also infused this idea that architecture has always been an object in landscape, if I may say.
Mm.
And this awareness brings one up to a level where the interconnectedness of everything starts to make a dent in one's own life. So in those 2 years of education in the master's course in landscape architecture, design opportunities are very few and spaced out. And I must say that in today's scenario, and I would not shy away from saying that, who teaches design? Who would teach design? Because if schools are going to only take professors who have done a PhD and have had no experience in the field itself, how on earth would they tackle questions on design, and therefore who would teach design? That's a very big issue. But
Right.
that said, while our country would take its own time to come to terms with this fact, and the tide would change again at one time when this shock would become real, where there's a vacuum of people who can design. So that will take its own time. But the important thing I think that we must realize is that the master's course in landscape architecture should be looked at as something that brightens and broadens the horizons.
Architecture. I think, to my opinion, we really have to be clear about, the professor's role and then the practicing architects. As mentioned earlier, also, this could be complementary, the theory and practice and the practice informing theory. Those kind of things are going on. My point is, when landscape architecture is dealt at master's level, it has to be more research based, so that you create knowledge that could come very handy to the practitioner. For example, I look at energy efficiency program that I started in my institution, and I'm largely, looking at the thermal comfort, providing thermal comfort to the pedestrians, while designing footpath by the use of landscape design. And we have been able to kind of, produce evidence to this, actual, observations, and then, producing knowledge, so that this could be used to reform the street design policies. So in that sense, this should be taken as a more complementary roles.
The landscape architecture, and especially the stage, or at the point when they are being called or when they are being appointed, that has been a very crucial thing. And I think we have to think about that. It's a total process. It's not a kind of an element or an other engineering service that will be added later, or it can be thought of later. Moreover, when we think about our architectural practice, even when as we are practicing architecture, I think we are also not aware of that. We have to start with this landscape perimeter, this landscape arena. That's very, very. I think there's a kind of negligence also, and there's a kind of what I should say of kind of being jack of all trades, almost like that. Architects know everything. Okay, so it's been a practice, I think, here also in Bangladesh, that recognizing the profession first, and recognizing the importance and its role in the whole process. And as Chaya said, that recognizing architecture as an object in the landscape perimeter. In that sense, we couldn't set our buildings properly, to be honest. When you think about the settings and when you think about the surroundings, the way we are practicing in the architecture, and then way it should be looked through the landscape, through the lens of the landscape architect, there's a difference. There's a real difference. So when we are as a practicing architect, or when we're studying the architecture education, I think this component, the landscape architect, it has to be intertwined. It has to be intertwined with the overall educational system in our overall educational
Good evening,
understanding.
everyone. Thank you for making me a part of the Saturday Sojourns. Yeah. So first of all, let me introduce Sri Lanka to you all. It's a little below India, and we have a similar climate as in, of course, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, Maldives, and a similar type of vegetation and a planting palette that can be seen here in these countries. And I'm sure that you all know that Sri Lanka was known as the Pearl of the Indian Ocean. This is, to date, we hold a very strong geopolitical position as well because of the location of Sri Lanka. It's a country that can within a 4 hours of drive that you can reach to all to a different climate. I would say we have if you go into our country, it's a cold climate which can be anywhere less than 10 centigrades, and if you go further up north, it can be even as worst as 40 degrees. And this, with the place, with the location and the climatic conditions, I think we have a very nutritious plant media that anything will grow, anything that you put in the soil. If you and because of this, Sri Lanka we have our own plantations of back in the day. It was mainly spices, but then with the foreign ruling, we had coffee and tea, and then to date we are more or less self-sufficient in terms of rice and all the spices and most of the vegetables, and of course fruits. So as I mentioned earlier, a beautiful garden is a part of the Sri Lankan culture or the lifestyle. No matter whether you are doing a job and live in a shanty, or whether you are a royal who lives in a palace, still you had a garden. In earlier days, before Christ, Sri Lankan civilization started along, of course, after the Aryans coming into Sri Lanka. The civilization started along reservoirs and the river-based villages. It was a agriculture-based civilization, and when Buddhism came to Sri Lanka, a temple was added to their lifestyle or the culture or the environment that they lived in. And these temples in Buddhism, they worship the temple that was that provided shade to Lord Buddha when he enlightened. So that was the main part of the temple, and they offer various flowers to Lord Buddha. So eventually these flowering plants plants that you can offer became a part of the temple. And to date, even some of the houses that you go to in Sri Lanka, whether it's a house of a royal or it's a house of a commoner, you'll still see a lot of plants that's being offered to Lord Buddha planted in their gardens. And if you go back to and look at Anuradhapura kingdom, which was again before Christ, there are still ruins of the Royal Botanical Gardens, and especially the ruins of temples will show that in present day we would call it a park or a resort. It's beautiful pathways, nicely done, laid out roads, and then grown jungles. And they have done a lot of forestry as well. And even in Anuradhapura, even in Polonnaruwa, it's the same. And these were all again river-based civilizations having agriculture as their main profession, and farming as their main profession. And then when it came to Sigiriya or Kotte, these kings were looking for protection. So they had protected themselves by creating a water barrier and various sorts of things to make it difficult to come and take over the kingdom. So these Sigiriya, if you look at Sigiriya, it's if you see the road system, it's a very symmetrical layout, and the planting. To date you see fruit garden, and then and gardens. They say the fragrance garden, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So where you see all these sorts of beautifully laid out landscapes, and Sri Lanka, anyway, being a tropical country and being with its location, the natural landscape itself is pretty extravagant. It's a landscape where you just need to I would say recorrect or complement whatever that's being put in there by other humans. If an architect does a house, we do complement the architecture of the house by landscape and merging the two, the existing landscape of the property into the new landscape that we do, so that the house and the residence will become a part of that environment. I think at present Sri Lankan architects and the clients or the builders, they use a lot of professional help when it comes to landscaping, especially I think after late Jeffrey Bawa, who made the buildings or the spaces of the buildings that he designed a part of the garden, or brought the garden inside into the house or to the building or to the space. So how I would quickly touch upon how Jeffrey was influenced to become an architect. That was because of brief. His brother, late Bevis Bawa, who was a planter, and at one point who was the ADC to the last 4 British governors, who worked as an honorary service to the government. His parents had given him 200 acres of rubber estate at the age of 20, when he was a planter. After him becoming a planter, to take care of it and run it as the head of the family, because their father had passed away by then. And after Bevis moved into this estate bungalow, to the manager's bungalow, he was expanding the house and the garden, eventually, which became a 5.5 acres of garden. And he says the garden and the house stopped growing when he ran out of money. That's in the 60s. So up until this property was given to him in 1929, and up until 1960 or late 60s, it has been just growing. To add more into it, this is the only private garden in Sri Lanka, and then tourist minister, who was the first executive president of Sri Lanka, Jasum Uddin, had invited Bevis to open this to the public, because this was the only tourism was booming in Sri Lanka at that time, and Bentara Resort was designed and being built by Jeffrey Bawa, and the only tourist attractions were one of the old temples, lovely beaches in the area. So the Jasum had invited Bevis to open this to the public, and this was opened to the public in 1969. And ever since it's open it's open to date, and a lot of visitors from all around the world visit the place. And it's a garden, it's a garden that was influenced by his foreign travels. I would say it's a European garden, and when you walk in there, you will see a lot of vistas and surprises, and a lot of life in it, a lot of color in it. And this garden, there is a Spanish garden, what he says, that he was influenced from his travels to Alhambra. Then there's Japanese garden, and he says from his trip to Far East in the 50s that he was influenced to do this. And in this you see a lot of hardscapes and a lot of monuments, a lot of statues and sculptures in the garden, which was done together with another Australian artist who lived there with Bevis, called Donald Friend, and of course some other artwork by Barbara Sansoni, late Barbara Sansoni, who was one of their close friends, and another lot of artwork by many other artists, including Russell Drysdale, an Australian artist, and from Sri Lanka, I would say a lot of late Lucky Saranaga's artwork, sculptures, and paintings are there. Today Brief is a place where a lot of students from Sri Lanka and other foreign countries who come there to learn and to see, and they say they get influenced by Brief, just like late Jeffrey Bawa, and who was influenced to basically to have who wanted to have a similar property. Then he went and bought Lyricist estate, where which was also rubber estate, and then to develop it he had to learn architecture. So he went back to England and went to the architecture school, and he came back as an architect, and he developed his own little kingdom there, which is known as Rehnuma, and that's how he became an architect, and he gave up being a solicitor, a barrister, and ever since he started building hotels, houses, which the landscape was a major part of, and Lunuganga also a major, a huge, a very, very, very British garden, I would say. It's the serenity there you can't find anywhere else, and the biodiversity, and it's a, I would say it's a grown jungle. I think with the tourism boom and the hotels coming up in Sri Lanka opened an opportunity to landscape gardening or landscape architecture to develop as a profession. And the rich and the elite has always been getting help from someone. Actually, how it happened was after Bevis laid out brief in let's say after 1940s, after independence, the rich and elite and the diplomats who were living in Sri Lanka, I would say the cream of the crop, they invited Bevis to do their gardens, and that's how Bevis became a landscape gardener. And then later on, he helped his brother in various of his projects, and especially Bentoro Beach Hotel, which is to date is a architectural marvel. I would say it's in a peninsula, and it's in a peninsula, so you get the river on one side and sea on the other side, and it's one place that a lot of foreigners would go and want to stay in Sri Lanka or to see, and ever since a lot of associates who worked with Jeffrey Bawa, Bevis Bawa, and Jeffrey had taken up landscape gardening as a profession, and then later on the Sri Lankan University University of Moratuwa had started, then University of Peradeniya had started offering landscape architecture masters for those who have completed their first degree in architecture, and now we have 30 to 40 landscape architects coming out every year, and it's becoming competitive in the market, and still they have a lot of jobs, and a lot of development is going on around in the country, even though we had a bit of problems during the pandemic, and then before that the Easter tax, but now the construction has slowly started again, and everyone's getting busy with their jobs. So I was an architect. I studied architecture and returned to Sri Lanka probably about 13 years ago, and just after the war, and I worked with an architect called Jasum, who was also I would say an assistant, or who did his training with Jeffrey Bawa in the late 80s, and so with Vinod I worked for almost 2 years, and then a lot of and my father was Bevis Bawa's manager, so we are the current owner. My father is the current owner of Brief, and then he did a lot of work with Jeffrey Bawa. Again, I would say his signature project is Kandalum Hotel, which is built on a rock, and now it's covered with a jungle, and I think Kandalum was where it influenced me to become an architect, and so being at Brief and being with my father being in the profession, I had the opportunity of associating a lot of architects and as close as my family, and they all said, I think they all wanted me to take up my father's practice, so I took it up, and now I'm running his design practice, and we have we have a staff of about 10 landscape architects and a few interns who are from the local University of Moratuwa. And we do a lot of local projects such as, houses to resorts to industrial projects to, I would say, commercial projects. And I'm happy that I took up on landscape architecture. And I would say, but it would have still been great to be an architect. But I think it helps me with my architecture knowledge and design knowledge, design the design practice I had working with the firms that I worked in, where I was trained, and the studies I did in Thailand and in Australia. So I think in terms of technology and technology issues, the root balling was taught to my father and late Lucky Naika back in the late 70s by a team of foreign team. This was to bring in trees to the Parliament complex that was designed by late Jeffrey Bawa, and ever since road building, I think now there are almost thousands of nurseries and with properly root ball trees, and now we buy our plants from them. To date, some of them are there who was trained under either late Lucky Naika or either under my father. And we in Sri Lanka we don't use a lot of machinery such as the root balling machine or anything. But then again, we do the drain boards or the drain cells were also we started using maybe in the mid 2000s with one of the major projects that happened that came up in Sri Lanka, major development with about 1,200 plus apartments and a garden of about 28,000 square meters, and on a rooftop garden. So that there we had to use drain boards, and ever since the geotextile and drain boards is a part of our game, I would say. And the knowledge I also learned from some of the staff we have, and the practical knowledge they have is it cannot be matched by any of us. And to the road balling, the watering, they sometimes even when it comes to certain projects and certain regions or certain areas that we work in, I would ask some of the people who has worked with us over the last 30-40 years, and in terms of the selection of the trees, and that's a knowledge, and that's not something that can be matched and or learned. Sri Lanka, in terms of the industry is definitely growing, and with the port city coming in, with the development that they are planning in tourism, and the apartments that's going to come in, definitely there's the major boom in landscape architecture, and it's a good field to be in. And the architects in Sri Lanka also they value the landscape part of it. They think that it does complement their work. So it's the job of the landscape architect or the designer to maintain that and bring out the best of the architect also with what they do. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. Hope you all have a good evening.
And perhaps I'll start with the second one. This notion of a style that you could, sort of see in the practice of landscape design in Sri Lanka. And I think perhaps it's something that triggers off from this sort of, two wonderful
examples that Dan showed, the two Bawa brothers who made these sort of two wonderful gardens, almost one by the side of the others, in that sort of post-colonial space in 1960s and 70s, where I think they were important from an experiential point of view, as we saw in those sort of almost filmic presentation that Dan did. They're wonderful spaces. There are collection of sequences and journeys and places inside places, all that is there. But at the same time, I think they're also important in the history of post-colonial nation. I think Aparna briefly spoke about modernity and how modernity was important in the young nations, coming from the colonial experience. And in landscape design in Sri Lanka, I think these two examples of gardens, negotiated well the challenge of modernity as well as history. I mean, if you look at those gardens, there were so many different sources, the vernacular tradition, the history of that place. There's a wonderful sequence that I don't know whether many of you have been to Lunuganga, Jeffrey's garden, but there's this sort of wonderful entry sequence, as you enter from the gate. Jeffrey framed this beautiful view of a stupa in the distance. So, you have Jeffrey's land, and then there's this sort of lagoon beyond that, and the stupa is behind that. So he brings this borrowed view into the landscape. And by doing that, he brings the vernacular of that place to the experience. So these are not just physical landscapes, these are also cultural landscapes. And this sort of, wonderful synergy of different histories, pre-colonial history, the colonial history, as well as, I guess, the post-colonial history, and then the sort of, the cosmopolitan way of bringing in other traditions, English gardens and, the picturesque Italian, Spanish gardens. So I think, the construction of these gardens were so important to the history of landscape design in Sri Lanka. And to answer your question, Bhagavad, I think I don't know whether it's a good thing or bad thing, but we are seemingly trapped in that wonderful, work that these two guys have done. I think even the notion of modernity is an unstable thing, isn't it? I mean, you have to constantly restage it. But if you look at, especially compare Jeffrey's gardens with Bevis gardens, I think Bevis Bawa's gardens are slightly much more spontaneous, more informal. I mean, I would even call them ordered wilderness. And I think, the next generation of architects, I mean, one comes to my mind is Vijita Basnayaka. I'm not sure whether you've heard of him, but he has this sort of notion of architecture as almost an undesigned process, and his gardens are also like that. They are spur of the movement, spontaneous interventions, which is essentially what I guess, even if you look at the history of landscape design in our part of the world, we have the grand tradition of the monasteries and Sigiriya, I think Dan showed you, but there's also the folk tradition. I mean, the gardens that people built. I mean, in the tropics, I mean, outdoor rooms, it's a way of life. So right. Everyone had an outdoor room. It's not a design garden. It's not a space that you would design for recreation. It's your living room, and they are pragmatic, but they're also experiential because with the tropics that you have the lush green and so on and so on. So I think the next generation of architects sort of try to bring this kind of informal, spontaneous localness into the garden as well. And I think it's something that even Davis had sort of explored in his work. But I think we have challenges of how we redefine landscape within our urban realm. How do you create new urban ecosystems and how you bring biodiversity to urban spaces, but also in that process, how we I guess, how we negotiate with social conflicts as well. Because if you look at, for example, wetlands in our part of the world, in the cities, we need to sort of protect and rediscover the wetlands, but then people have encroached onto them. You have slums and informal settlements. So it's not just something. I mean, I think we spoke about the notion of collaboration. Sunit and others brought that in. I mean, it's not a conduct of landscape designers alone. I mean, it's political,
of course not,
and so on and so on. But I think we have that challenge of how we sort of bring that notion of taking care of the land in the urban realm.
I think Sri Lankan tradition, I think traditionally we are part of the landscape, because being in the tropics, like we just need a roof over our heads. We don't need anything else, because our kind of climate is such, if we have a roof over our head, we can survive. We don't need to kind of enclose it. We don't have harsh cold climate. We don't have the harsh heat. So maybe that kind of natural living traditionally, or like, okay, historically, Dan showed the Ranmasuyanas and the Ritigalas, where our kind of traditional, I would say, landscape parks for its monasteries. Always it was the monasteries that had this thing. I would say the Bava brothers kind of revived it. I think what they did was, like, post-colonial, like soon after we got independence, we had this kind of nationalist kind of notion where everyone was kind of thinking of the traditional things. And before that, what we believe is Jeffrey Bawa is the one who revived the Sri Lankan tradition in a modern way. It's called the tropical modernism. So that was part of this whole thing of landscape. Also, like what Dan said, he was influenced by Bevis, and like also Melinda said, the Bevis's garden is kind of, I would say, more reflective of his character as well, as opposed to Jeffrey Bawa's, because I think Bevis Bawa was more of a kind of a son of the soil kind of a person, so his garden also reflects that. And going on to the point 3, where you asked about the landscape and the landscape architect and the architect working together, right? That was the question.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say in Sri Lanka, well, landscape architects play a big role. I mean, if I talk about myself, I'm a small-time architect. I work on like small urban houses, very tight urban spaces, and where I always try to get the inside and outside together, because I always want the house to extend to the garden and not be two things. So my kind of approach to architecture is, it's kind of always, there are certain specialists in this field, where you have an architect, you have a structural engineer, you have the MEP. Similarly, the landscape architect plays a big role, however small the project is. So therefore, I feel the landscape architect is not kind of some kind of a secondary thing where, okay, he might come in, or you do the house and let the kind of the client do whatever he wants. My approach has not been that, because I always believe that is an integral part of design.
Right now, in few projects going on, which are actually designed and built by the Chinese companies, there are landscapes or the designs done by them, which is, I personally feel that they are quite alien to Sri Lanka, because you see a lot of colors and tiny little bushes here and there. So especially Colombo, I mean, we use, or at least the architects I work with, or the architects and the landscape architects in general, except for Norelia, we use permanent plants in our projects. But Norelia is actually like the capital of the hill country sort of a thing. It's the temperature is around 5 to 10 degrees around the year. So there we have seasonal plants. There we plant, I mean, whatever we plant, they are with a shorter span. So their focus is for April. So they just want them to bloom and the garden to be nice during that season. And by December, the garden is gone and you have to redo it.
Sure.
But rest of the country, we do a permanent outfit. So I mean, this, so like I said, so there are about 2-3 projects like this, which happen in Colombo, which were constructed by the China state and what the other Chinese company. They had their own landscape architects, and they had a landscaping company also called China Garden something, which worked in Sri Lanka. But once it was handed over to whoever the client, later on they got someone involved from the local, one of the local guys, to come and do a little bit of touch-ups and to change it, to make it more Sri Lankan, I would say. So more to make it more tropical.
I mean, as a layman, I would say the landscape architects, when they work with in the coastal line, they use these particular kind of trees or plants which are conducive for this, you know, which will grow and which also will screen off certain things that you might have to cut off the monsoon, kind of, you know, the sea breeze and things like that. From my experience as an architect and as a kind of a islander, that's what I have kind of seen. And well, I don't know, Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I want to start this with something else. Now our tourism is mainly based on the coastal areas, and the local, the beach boys and the people who lives around these coastal areas, they keep the beach and the areas surrounding it clean, because that's their livelihood. That's where they earn a buck. So when we do hotels, and most of the hotels we have along the coast, they have a garden which is open to the beach. And more than the hotel staff or the hotel gardening staff, the local beach boys or the vendors, they make sure there's nothing, I mean, it's all cleared in front of the hotel and there's nothing going on. It's crystal clean most of the time. So this way we can, whatever the garden, what sort of, like, for example, if we do so like, I mean, the answer to your question is, yes, we have a planting palette that we use on the coastal areas, and that's actually different from the southern coastal belt to the eastern coastal belt, because the salinity of the air is less on the southern coastal belt, especially during the low tide. Low tide is our season in Sri Lanka. The main tourist season in Sri Lanka is during low tide, that is from November to April. So during that time, I would say any plant will grow by the beach. Not any plant, but, like, you know, even a semi-tolerant plant will grow there. So it's just that.
This is Manifa Rehnuma, presenting for Saturday Sojourn 2022. I thank Live Foundation and Landscape India for inviting us to present here. Our presentation focuses on the nature, people, history, and culture of Bangladesh, and how all these factors have influenced our design process. Whenever we think about Bangladesh, the first thing comes into our mind is that it's the largest delta in the world. 35% of Ganges Delta lies in Bangladesh. It was created almost 125 million years ago by the collision of Indian plate with the Eurasian plate. At the time, it was a basin. There wasn't any formation of land. The Ganges and the Brahmaputra, created through the Himalaya, deposited their alluvial soil here in the basin, eventually resulting the delta. This land was avoided by the Vedics because of its obscuredness. If we see this image from NASA, it clearly shows that the aquatic veins are inserting in the basin. Almost every external ruler used to avoid this place. Funnily, according to Ibn Battuta, Bengal was Dozak Puri Niyamat, means hell full of bounty. Because our land is so fertile, anything and everything grows here just like magic beans. These are what Bangladesh comprises of. The genius loci is embedded in the uniqueness of the delta, intertwined with 257 rivers, flora, fauna, architecture, geography, inspirational figures, the history, the literature, all are interconnected in this deltaic language. To understand the culture of Bangladesh, we have to look deeply into our nature. In April, we celebrate Bengali New Year by eating panta and ilish. The heat is relieved through monsoon rain from mid-June to mid-August. Later on, we see the ripening of paddy field, the whiteness of kashful, and also we feel the coolness in the air in the late autumn. By harvesting the rice, we celebrate Nobanno in this season. When the winter comes, we observe purging in the nature. The leaves falls, we see the skeletons of trees. The color is given back and nature gets back into life in spring. But let me tell you, all these changes are hard to observe in the city. One must go to the suburb or village to feel the changes. We have many forms of ethnic and religious festivals. Durga Puja, Eid al-Fitr, Buddha Purnima, Christmas are to name a few. Let's have a look into the geophysical attributes of Bangladesh. 80% of the land is inundated through Ganges, Brahmaputra and Meghna floodplains. As we can see, there are ranges of hills on our eastern side expanding from south to north. 8% of the land is old Pleistocene soil. The soil is raised here. North of Dhaka is part of this tract. On the southwestern corner, we have the tidal active delta where Sundarban is situated. Here, salinity is rising with climate change. From these geophysical attributes, we have gathered information about 4 types of forests. Here, it's the hill forest that lies on the southeastern fringe of the country. It's a mixed evergreen forest. Tall species of Bengal can be found here. At the heart of Bangladesh, we have Sal forest, which is a deciduous forest. Dhaka used to be a part of its extended area. Madhupur tract we talked about earlier is the key feature of Powell. The Sundarban on the southwest corner of the country has its other part on the West Bengal, India. It's also the home to Royal Bengal tiger. The mangrove has 2 parts. One is saline mangrove and the other is the freshwater mangrove. For such a small country, we have a myriad types of forests. This one, the last one I am presenting, is one of the rarest forests in the world, the Ratargul, a freshwater forest. It's home to monkey, egret, vultures, and freshwater aquatic plants which can be found around Bangladesh. To understand the landscape style of Bangladesh, we have carefully articulated the historical timeline of architecture in Bengal briefly. Because to absorb landscape, we must follow the evolution of architecture through ages. Buddhist Paladeva, Indo-Terracotta, Mughal architecture, colonial architecture, all are dotted in this riverine landscape of Bengal. Messrs. Dickinson illustrated a colonial cityscape of Dhaka beside the Buriganga. The post-colonial period reflects the modernist, brutalist architecture style of then contemporary world, mostly governments, institutional buildings. Post-liberation war to present day, the architecture of Bangladesh is still evolving. It again reflects the sophistication of complex programs from technically sound buildings of architect Mustafa Khalid Polash to Arung building of architect Patrick de Rosario to architect Kashef Mahboub's Friendship Hospital. Talking about architecture of Bangladesh will be incomplete without reflecting on the works of architect Mazharul Islam Sir. Mazharul Islam Khan was the pioneer architect of Bangladesh. His works from the 1950s onwards not only signaled the advent of modernism in Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, but almost overnight introduced a fresh culture of architecture. Here we can see his master plans of fine art institutes to Jahangirnagar University master plan, the mega projects woven in the deltaic landscape. I was asked how Luyai Khan has any influence on our landscape design, as his most cherished work, IIM, is in Ahmedabad, India. Khan had showed how to create a modern citadel beside water and green to the generations of architects to come in Bangladesh. Mazharul Islam Khan had brought Luyai Khan to design the parliament building. Khan had suggested lately that in Bangladesh, one must be a land architect responding to the lucid landscape. As we move on, we try to investigate the available written or built example of landscape planning and design in history of Bengal. The earliest account is available of Khana, an astrologer of Rar area. Here, the subcontinental political boundary is considered. We tried to frame the Mughal influence along with colonial influence which shaped modern Dhaka. Khana was an astrologer reflecting the vegetal landscape of the era. In 12th century Bengal, Bihar, Assam, agriculture maxims were in use by the farmers. There's a story. Farmers during the reign of Bengali King Vikramaditya faced problems with weather forecasts, seasonal plantations, when to plow for better yielding. So, Khana made an astronomical predictions which soon became true, and she became popular. They are in fact still in use. Some of them we can see on the screen. Pube hash, Pushchime bash, Uttore bere, Dokkhine chhere, which means on the east of a house one will find duck on pond, bamboo on the west to cut scorching heat of west. On the north, one should plant banana, and the south should be left open for better airflow and full bright sun in this region. There's another maxim which says, Nimni shinda jatha, manush ki more tatha, which says, will anyone fall ill or die if there's neem and Chinese chest trees? 13th century Shunya Puran is also worth mentioning. Written by Ramai Pandit, it had 5 chapters. One was called Dhaner Janmo, how dhan or rice took birth from the semens of Lord Shiva. And at that time, Bengal and Rar area had the only religion of farming. Lord Shiva as the farmer lord has been depicted here. Through Shunya Puran, we can see the floriculture of the Middle Age Bengal, where Sultani dynasty was emerging parallelly. We can find the local native plants used for the Dharma Puja of Dharmaraj in Pushpotolan rituals. Gradually, our focus moves to Dhaka because the Mughal landscape design is found here through walled gardens, forts, and architecture. The Mughals established Jahangirnagar in Dhaka and brought their Persian-influenced Indo-Islamic landscape gardens and elements into this deltaic flat plain. The gridiron patterns, exotic plants, walled gardens were introduced. And it was a very new concept in this subcontinent. The image depicts the technique of Mughal gardening from Diwani Anwari. As the British took over the Mughal territory, the usage of old Baghi Badshahi katras were converted for new usage. Charles Dawes cleared the Ramna and created a racecourse arena. Mr. Proudlock was appointed as the head arboriculturist. He introduced Malai Padau plants, which we still find beside the Ramna roadsides. We jump back to West Bengal again to Shantiniketan, because without mentioning Ratindranath Tagore, the whole story won't be fulfilled. Ratindranath Tagore, son of Rabindranath Tagore, designed many exotic gardens, Japanese style, Mughal style in Shantiniketan. He experimented with the plantation of several exotic trees inside the ashram, which was supervised by Rabindranath Tagore himself. He built a soil testing laboratory, imported plant seeds, borrowed tractors, and customized the farming equipments. This created a new trend in gardening in Bengal. On this side of Bengal, in Dhaka, there was an uprising competition of varied garden houses. Balda Garden by Zamindar Narendra Narayan Chaudhary was an epitome of display of local and exotic plants. Parallelly, Rose Garden, Fairley House was established by zamindars and British officials. Dvijen Sharma, a Bangladeshi naturalist, botanist and writer who contributed in the civic landscape design of Bangladesh, he urged the necessity of native plantation in urban context and prescribed it through his writing. He wrote 30 books on nature and plants of Bangladesh. After Liberation War, we find war memorials and monuments of mega scale in lush fluid settings. During 90s, there was only Dhanmondi Lake for Dhaka city dwellers to breathe the fresh air after Ramna. Later on, from 2015 onwards, we have seen a surge in restoring the parks and playgrounds of Dhaka North and South. Another finer example of community-involved landscape design is found in Jinaida of reclaiming old Noboganga River and public space. I hope everyone is still listening. The previous studies are all somehow implanted deeply in our subconscious. It will reflect in the upcoming presentation about Orden's projects. We have experimented and took challenges. Often, we do exercise our skills and took over voluntary initiatives. Most of our projects deal with ecology, history, settlements, and gardening. This is our very first project. Usually, the mosque premises have courtyards of hard surfaces. The prayer hall was grounded into the green. This place by nature demanded a scaled-down building emerging from the soft landscape where the users come mostly barefooted. We opted for a solution which will be both pervious and impervious. We created surface which works as a sieve so that the water flows relentlessly. In a small village, it was a challenge to subdue the presence of the mosque in the landscape. It's a story of hanging gardens in the dense urban setting of Dhaka. The raw landscape of Bengal has been inserted into the busy commercial building. The sketch shows, in the beginning, we had proposed a vegetal landscape where pop-up decks would float on the sea of green. We tried to create a moist landscape on the roof and planted a welcoming chatim tree at the entry plaza, who stands tall. It silently merges with the ultra-urban setting with its nativeness. If we remember Ratargul, where hijol tree is found, has been planted on the rooftop of impetus on the way to swimming pool. Alocasia is a common plant beside ponds in villages. Instead of formal setup, we tried to create an outdoor of lush ordinary shrubs. We experimented with the details, and everyone will find their nooks and niches in this setting. Padgati Shashan in Tungipara is a temple complex comprises of mandir, nat mandir, and crematorium. The mild sloped floodplain of Madhumati River helped to form the master plan, which sits at the end of the road, surrounded by homesteads. A 9 into 60 meter narrow site at the entrance, there was a Ficus bengalensis, the bodgach, which we tried to preserve, as it has both ecological and religious significance. In this narrow site, the community demanded to keep a regular circulation for them so that they can easily go to the other side of the temple. The perforated boundary and plaza made of bricks are inspired from the local crafts of weaved pati bet. Faridpur graveyard gave an opportunity to recreate the concept of paradise, the walled garden from Quran. It all started with boundary design for the privacy, where delineation is very important. After burial in rural context, it's essential to keep safe the boundary. Boundary has become an essential element of our landscape design. We took the social challenge to define a dystopia where the territory of the outer world ends. The Mughal gridiron planning and sitting pavilions were the key guiding factors. At the entrance, there's a pond on the eastern side and an Eidgah on the west, creating a gateway for afterlife. Eidgah at Gopalganj, a space for congregational prayer during the celebration of Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. In an urban context, it's difficult to create a massive backdrop for Eidgah. In a rural, semi-suburban context, this Eidgah has become a social icon. It has created a place of belongingness. It's a frozen element in the lush green, while it has a measurable dimension in this digital era. Also, other than the congregational prayer, twice a year, walkways, sitting areas, native planting pallets for community have been integrated. Cox's Bazar 5-kilometer road urban design regeneration project was a great challenging project where we were the landscape consultant to DPM. Local boats, Burmese market, beach were the design inspirations. It's a tourist city of seasonal tourists. Last year, during the New Year season, there were almost 10 lakh, 1 million local tourists flooded the city. Beyond standard practice, the encroachment, urban sprawls are regular dysfunctionalities. As developing country, creating a new standard for road with pedestrians and facilities with basic amenities were the very basic challenges. A saline-prone soil, low maintenance material was selected for bridges and toilets and other amenities. Colorful surfaces designed by artist Shumon Paul were proposed to invoke memories. The diaspora of the Burmese market was brought by the Burmese brocade design, which we implemented it into a pavement pattern. Each project is a milestone. Ananya Shakhat was a great initiative by the local government engineering department of Bangladesh. It's an interactive memorial where one moves through it, absorbing the intense relationship between Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Hussein Shahid Sohrawardi. The glass wall represents Sohrawardi, who illuminated young Bangabandhu. Thus, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman emerges as a strong leader, which is symbolized through this red wall. Last but not least, Bangladesh Academy of Rural Development was designed by Doxiadis in 1960s, who created the master plan of Islamabad. It was initiated by Akhtar Hamid Khan. The project was commissioned to Deacon and Bhumijo JV as consultant, and later on we joined on as landscape consultant. We got the opportunity to do the rigorous site analysis for this 54 acre of land, which is a very rare occasion for us, because the site analysis of an architect differs from landscape architect's perspective. The team's co-partners were also appreciative toward the role we played naturally through our practice and iterations. As we are in an architect-dominated society, there remains rare scopes to hone our skills in such projects. This slide shows our rigorous analysis process, and finally we emerge with the proposal where pedestrian circulation was designed through promenade and shaded walkways. Doxiadis was inspired by the Mughal pavilion-styled architecture. Keeping that in mind, we enhanced and elongated this circulation into the heart of the master plan, where all the public amenities like the sports centers, the tanks, the hostels are connected through single line of spine. This area, Bird, is situated on Lalmai Pahar, which used to be a part of Lalambi forest full of medicinal plants. There is a beautiful story in Ramayana that Hanuman was going to rescue Lakshman by lifting a huge mountain from Himalaya. During the flight with Sanjeevani, a tiny droplet fell here, and the myth has it's been growing as Lalambi forest since then. But with time, the flora and fauna was lost. We can find some similarities of hill tract flora and faunas. However, during the mid-80s and 90s, the area was planted with fastest revenue-earning plants like acacia, mahogany, which eventually have played a negative role for the environment. With response to that, we proposed a plantation scheme phase by phase for each zone, emphasizing seasonal and native varieties. These are the unrealized projects. The first one is the garden house in Kiraniganj of Minister Nazrul Hamid Bipu. We tried to create a beautiful tropical palette of native floras surrounding his existing mango trees of his ancestral house. NHA Playground lies at the heart of Dhaka city. It's a very old playground surrounded by elite residential area. Skating ground, age-based plays, jogging tracks, sitting areas, and native plantations were key features of this playground design. So what's next? Emerging profession, I believe landscape architecture holds lots of hopes. Because in the upcoming world where the climate change is the biggest issue, I believe landscape architects have the greatest opportunity to rejuvenate, preserve, and conserve the nature. In fact, in mega projects, the government of Bangladesh has imposed a mandatory criteria to intake landscape architects in design team. By 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal aims to achieve sustainable cities and communities, life below water and life on land, where landscape architects will play a vital role. There is a dying need of educating our upcoming generations of professionals, co-consultants, architects and planners, and educators. We need to establish a dialogue to start the pedagogy in landscape architecture in Bangladesh. As an individual IFLA member, my fellow landscape architects and I are in a process of creating a new platform for landscape architects in Bangladesh. On the right, the picture represents my participation in a hackathon arranged by Delta Race, who are doing the 100 years Delta Plan. With dreams of new beginning and hopes, I end my presentation here today. Thank you for listening to me. I dedicate this presentation to my late daughter, Nawal Fatiha Hassan. Investigating the landscape history. So I started with Kona, the astrologer. She was the astrologer who actually saw the sky and her wisdom was rooted into the soil. So from that, I took the inspiration as well. And she has so many maxims of how to plant trees, which trees on which side, or from where the southern winds are coming, and how to design a courtyard-based architecture. So it was already embedded in that 12th century scriptures or her maxim, because still the farmers use them to calculate the rain or the soil temperature, whatever it is. They are still in use in Bengal, in Assam, and in Rar area of West Bengal. So that's one part, more rooted to wisdom. But about my projects, which are more as if I give the example of the Idgah, which we talked about, it's more of a wall, but behind that wall, we had planted so many, as I mentioned, that native floras. But in Bangladesh, the landscape industry is so new. We have seen that all other countries, they have their setups already gone a long way. But we have started maybe in last 1 decade, and gradually we are going forward. So the nursery setup isn't there. So if we go for native plantation or more mature tree, if we want to give a look of more complete project, we need such nursery setups. But behind that wall, there was a glimpse that in 10 years, how it's going to look. So that wall is going to be totally covered by the polash tree, which is more taller than that wall. And in season, it's going to reflect the red flowers without any leaves. So it's very beautiful. So, but it will take time, I guess, to look up to the horizon. For us, I think we need more time because the plants, and we have to be more patient. We have to be more patient. That's what I say. That's what I want to say. And
Do you have any questions?
And I'd say that Doxiadis or Louis Icahn, all of them were foreign architects, but mostly master architects who had their own experience, and they had already been through so many projects. So Bangladesh was like a experimental ground for them. So if we see Doxiadis's experience, he saw Bangladesh from a plane. And he came to Bangladesh from Islamabad in a straight line. Even the map shows that he connected the Kumilla bird with Islamabad and how he's going to fly over here. And he landed on a amphibian plane. So he landed on water, and then he looked around the context. So to him, he addressed Bangladesh as terra incognita. So it's hidden behind so many layers of land, so many layers of water. So that's how he tried to create maybe and he took influence from the Mughal architecture and those pavilion-like colonnades. So those we can see in his master plan, or mostly, because in our setup, things are not preserved well. Because it was done in 1960s, most of the things have been lost. But in terms of our assembly building, it's been preserved quite well, or its surroundings, as it's at the heart of the city and it's a very major establishment. So Louis Icahn also showed us how to use water surrounding a huge, massive structure, and taking inspiration from this land, and how one should approach it with its screening and its weather.
And I think it's this notion that you begin to sort of sense very much and very strongly in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and surely in Bangladesh. Pakistan and India tend to be in that sense similar, that in our cities, in the work that we are doing, you don't tend to see this deep connection with land, deep connection with water, deep connection with the changing seasons, deep connection with culture, myth. But you see it in these three countries. And India and Pakistan seem to have moved slightly in a different, or at least the way Komal presented, we seem to have moved in a slightly different direction. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's just because we're hearing?
No. I think there is, in the last Saturday, I was thinking there are two kinds of ways of approaching both architecture and landscape architecture. One is the absolute attention to what is under your feet and what's around you as a body. And both the Sri Lankan and the Bangladeshi architects and landscape architects seem to be able to do that better. They're less comfortable where the sky becomes huge. And it was amazing that in Lahore, the sense of the infinite, and in Nepal also, though the works did not attend to that extent, but in Nepal too, the sky is a huge presence. And this is something which Kazi calls the rice growing cultures and the wheat growing cultures kind of difference, which is a line across in the humid and forested kind of area versus the vast lands, flat with big horizons, big skies. And maybe the learning that we have to do from each other is from Bangladesh, we have to learn to look down nearer our feet. And the Bangladeshis and the Sri Lankans have to learn from Nepal and Pakistan and maybe some parts of India how to look at the sky.
Today's presentations were quite, substantial. But there was a big difference between the two. And I think Bangladesh, the way it started to understand the context and the culture, and through which, the approaches developed, was something, which was very convincing. And I think, this is very important, because I think we were talking even last time that how does one really reflect to the context, when it comes to landscape and architecture both. I personally don't distinguish between the two. I think it is, these two are, it cannot exist without combination, because I think they're too much integrated with each other. And if we try to separate them, then I think we are making a mistake. So this is something, which I very strongly feel. And I think it is also, in a sense, our overzealous, need for specializations, that have really ended up in this kind of a situation. Architecture and is sort of encompassing everything. And I think what somebody was suggesting as sensitizing the courses from the beginning is something,
Right.
Which we all have to really think about.
Komal, yes. Do you think that there is genuinely a value in trying to create some sort of network for the younger professionals to be able to plug into various offices, academics, writers, poets, projects, maybe online, maybe physically, and it would help better understand each other and improve the thinking around work in our countries? Do you think that I'm sure something like this has been tried, and what do you think, or what else do you think should be done?
No, I certainly believe, because I must also recollect, my discussions with your father in 2007, when we established the course in conservation. Chaya would know, because I think it was actually, it was his initiative, that actually resulted in establishing the course. Now, we did that under architecture, now Faculty of Architecture. So I think after 2-3 years, you see, Professor Bhagwat started taking a lot of interest in my course. And I similarly went into the landscape, department. And more, we sort of started realizing that there is so much of commonness, between the two. And that was, the course was in conservation. You see, the thrust was on something which was extremely, clear, that it is architecture alone, whether historical or contemporary. It was on architecture, but it was not without the idea of the context, because the whole issue of architecture now and the built environment is seen as historic urban landscape. So in the advanced course in conservation, we more and more started looking at historic urban landscape, which was not talking only about the settlements or buildings, but it was actually taking in consideration the entire ecology, if in a sense, if I say that, because it was considered that the locale and flora, fauna, and also the regional context played such a tremendous role in establishment of settlements. And when we go further in architecture course, I think we always discuss urban design, but I think in a sense we discuss the settlements and designing within settlements. So I think at that point in time, we really, sort of thought that it is absolutely essential that, landscape was something which was missing even when we talked of conservation. And I think we should really strengthen that by amalgamating the two.
It was a huge learning when we, so when we began, we just thought it would be nice to have conversations and talk to our neighbors and understand what's happening in the countries, around India, in the subcontinent. We actually didn't, we thought it was important to start talking to each other, and I didn't expect that it would come, this far. In fact, I'm so sorry. So it was something like this, that today we are. I just thought that today, now is the time that landscape architects, or as a profession, one needs to start talking to each other. So there is this whole activism about global crisis, and there's so much happening, and we have, our lands are all connected, and we just wanted, we share the same history, we all come from the same place. So why are we talking to each other? So would things change? Would things get better? Or it's also this sort of a curiosity as to what our neighbors are doing. So it all just began from there.
Hi everyone. Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who has kind of been able to join us. Thank you to all the presenters. Thank you to all the discussants. Like Aparna said, I think when we started, we really just wanted to set up a platform where we could have these conversations, and Zoom problems notwithstanding, I hope we were able to kind of at least put a start to that conversation. And I think, like everyone is saying, we would, now that we've kind of started this process, I hope we're able to kind of continue it going forward, whether it's in a semi-formal setting like this, or whether it's in a more kind of one-on-one impersonal setting. But yeah, mostly I would just like to thank everyone who's been a part of this. Thank Aparna, thank all the presenters, and thank you all the discussants who've taken the time to join us over these 2 days. And I think we will close here. We've already taken up a lot of your time. So thank you everyone. Have a very good evening. Yeah, thank you so much.
अरे कल कलाया हर्षा उठे बैठा रातल छाया हर्षे बैठा रातल छाया नाउ चरिया दे बालुराया दे चल चलाया